Welcome to another segment of Sage Advice. I have my friend Jeremy Crawford here. Oh, wait, this is Dragon Plus. Actually, my fault. But we're using this for Sage Advice for this week's podcast, so it all counts. In that segment on Dragon Talk, we talked to Jeremy Crawford about fun stuff that's going on within the D&D rules. And this one is a little bit different from that segment in that we are going to be answering a whole bunch of questions from the community, and we're using our hour here in the absence of Bart Carroll. Dragon Plus is usually what happens here to do so. So bear with us. We're using this for two different purposes, so there might be some back and forth going on here. But we want to make sure both of you in podcast land and here on the Twitch channel got to have all of the fun that is talking to Jeremy Crawford, pretty much.
Well, and I like to think you and Bart are just having a war over which of you gets to have a Twitch show with me.
Exactly, right? There's only so much time that Jeremy can lend to this stuff, so we got to push and pull until we get you on to our shows. Exactly. So there are a whole bunch of questions that can be addressed. The Twitch chat is one way to do that. We also collected a whole bunch of them from Twitter as well as other sources, so we always have a bunch of questions to get through. But I believe Lauren Obo Crazy is helping us get all those questions into a place where we can read them from the Twitch chat. So we thank you. I do have it here in front of me, so I'll be monitoring that as well. But yeah, let's get to some of the first questions.
Let's bring it on.
What on this first page did you want to jump into? I really like the spellcasting question from Radlike. How would you go about making a new spell list for an existing class?
That's a great question. And I like this question because it's about revising something that already exists. And something I've talked about in previous episodes is often, even when you're designing something brand new, you want to start with something that already exists, partly so that you are making sure to couch your design in the game that we already have. Right. Now, your design, as it evolves, might completely burst out, sort of like a caterpillar bursting out of its cocoon and turning into a butterfly. But it's good to start with the familiar to make sure your design is growing out of native soil.
Right.
So when it comes to tweaking the spell list of an existing class, really think about what your motivation is for doing that. Are you doing it for a story reason? Maybe it's because wizards in your home campaign setting actually are known as great healers, and so you've decided you want to add some healing magic to the wizard spell list. Or you might decide that you're dealing with a version of the cleric class that delves deeply into necromantic magic, and so you want to instead add this dark death magic to the cleric list. The point I'm getting at is make sure you have a theme. Don't just say, I want this one class to have all the best spells in the game. And I say that not actually primarily for balance reasons, it's actually for world building reasons. Often I like to say that our design is as much about telling a story about D&D worlds as it is about things like balance, making sure the play experience is smooth. Those things are important to us. But what we're saying about your character, what we're saying about the D&D worlds, that's also really important. And again, a class that just simply has every best spell in the game, at that point, if you did that, you'd basically be almost saying that in your world, they're the only spellcasters. And so actually, I just talked myself into, if that's the story you're telling, maybe your story is all the other spellcasters are gone, and there is only one spellcasting class, well, then you could just create the master spell list. So again, short version of the answer is start with a theme. Don't just go for, all the highest damage spells or all the highest healing spells or all the most interesting illusion spells. Pick the spells that are thematic and work those into the list that you're modifying. You'll notice with those tips in mind that when you look at the spell lists in the player's handbook, as well as shorter spell lists that we sometimes give subclasses, like some of the subclasses in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, that we've done exactly this. We have not given all of the best spells to every class. Instead, it's a mix of story elements we're telling about each subclass and class, and also stories we are maintaining from D&D's past. Because D&D, for instance, has long held that healing magic is largely associated with the classes that we sometimes refer to as divine casters, whereas the most destructive magic tends to be associated with those classes we think of as arcane casters. Of course, we toss all of that out when we're dealing with a class like the Bard, which is a mix of everything. But again, that's part of the Bard's story. So start with a theme, and then apply the theme. And if you do in the world where you're doing this, if you do have the other spellcasters, make sure that once you're done with the revision of one spellcaster's list, you've still left a juicy story niche for the other spellcasters.
I like that too, and plus it's also a lot easier to design something when you start from a template, when you start from something that already exists. Because I don't know about you, but when I see a blank page, it's very discouraging. So if at least you're editing something that starts from a place that is good. I think that's great advice just for anybody who wants to dabble in design.
Yeah, especially as you're starting out. I mean, over time, you'll get excited by the blank canvas and want to create something wholly new, but always great, to start building on the shoulders of the people who've come before you.
Very cool.
Next question.
This question is from Ghost Hack 159. Can a character attempt to use their acrobatics to grapple an opponent, like a contortionist or a martial artist with holds and locks, or can you only grapple with strength?
So the rule as written is that if you are using the grapple option in the combat chapter of the player's handbook, you're using strength and athletics. I preface that by saying the rule as written because one of the rules of the game is that dungeon masters, based on circumstances, can mix and match the ability score used for a check as well as the skill used for a check. And so if a player compellingly describes, this sort of contortionist performance meant to grapple somebody, many DMs would allow that. Yeah. So I have to basically say again, the rule as written is it's strength and athletics, but also the rule as written is that the DM is free to change that. And I, as DM, love mixing and matching ability scores and skills because it's a great way to reward creative player description of what their character is doing. So I love saying yes when a person describes this awesome way that they're using their ability scores and their skills in an unexpected way and making it possible for them to use that combination in the game. This, by the way, is something that we have started to feature a little more in our books than we have in the past. So people will notice particularly in a few places in Dragon Heist that we have mix and matched ability scores and skills the way it's described in the player's handbook for that option of using skills in unusual ways. I bring this up because typically our published adventures have followed sort of the typical ability score skill matchup, and we've realized good for us to show by example for anyone who hasn't experienced it at their game table how this is done.
That's cool. I like that because it's creative storytelling. Yeah. Right? That's exactly what the game is meant to do, and I like that people are thinking outside the box, and that should be rewarded instead of discouraged. Right? That makes sense to me.
Now, I do have to say that if you find yourself in the position of designing, let's say you're writing something for Adventurers League or for an official D&D product someday, often you have to make the distinction in your mind then. When you're in that position, suddenly when you're writing professionally for the game, you have to make a distinction in your mind between what you would do at the table as a DM and what's in this book. Because the people who are playing official content expect that official content to sync up with the core books. And so even though everyone listening has heard members of our team say, well, we do all sorts of wacky things in our games that are not covered in the core books. Well, that's because we're DMing them, and one of the rules of the game is the DM can play fast and loose with the rules. But when you're working on the game in an official capacity, it has to support the game that's in the books so that it can be used smoothly by as many people as possible.
Right.
So if you ever find yourself making that transition from being a D&D hobbyist to doing the work professionally, you've got to make that transition in your mind, that you no longer get to do all the wacky stuff you do at your table. You can still do wonderful creative things, but they need to be tied a little more closely to what people expect because of what's said in the books.
Right. That makes sense. Good guidelines there. So here's a really specific question that I don't know if this is just a yes or no, but Armando Doval asks, can scrying create a sensor inside Layman's tiny hut?
Ooh, that's a good question. So let's come back to that one because I'm going to want to look up. Look it up in the book so that I can actually give a helpful answer.
Right.
So here, I'm going to write a note to myself. And later in the episode,
when there's some downtime.
Yes.
Yeah, look at those. That makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Let's do one of our old questions.
Okay, sure. Let's see. What is a good one? Well, I like this one. This is more of a you question. Which, and this is from Outprint Mind, so thank you for this question. Which subclass options published in books or Unearthed Arcana are you the most proud of? And which ones were you the least happy with? Like, which were the ones that you were like, oh, those need more work?
Oh, wow. Anytime I get asked this, it's always tough for me because I think of especially everything in our books as my kids. And
so you don't want to have favorites?
It's like,
right.
pick your favorite kid. And so, of course, the one you don't pick is going to be very sad.
So what's your favorite one? Let's start with that. Right. That's an easier one.
So when it comes to subclasses and classes in our books, there are things I love about every single one of them. And that's not only because of working on the text for all of them, but also through the playtest process at various points, getting to play or DM for them. I love the story potential that they have. I like the different rules options that they represent. I have always, of course, a special fondness for anyone that I worked more on myself, or if it ties into my D&D nostalgia. So, like, I have a special love, for instance, for the wizard subclasses in the Player's Handbook because I worked on those extensively.
Oh, really? Okay.
And same with the cleric domains, both the cleric domains and the wizard subclasses. I did a lot of work myself on those, and they tie very much into the game's past. They tie into the game's world building, this idea of schools of magic and the gods with their domains. I love that cosmic side of the game.
That is really cool.
And so I love it whenever we do any class design that taps into that cosmic side of the game.
Right.
So similarly in Xanathar's Guide, I love the Glamour Bard because of its connection to the Feywild. Again, there's that sort of cosmic theme.
Yeah.
I loved working on the Horizon Walker for the Ranger. I really like any subclass option as a designer that is not only about the person, but talks about the person's connection to the broader world, where essentially the class and the subclass working together give you a window into not only what this character is like, but you get to peek through and you're getting a glimpse of a whole world. So then I'd say the flip side is the subclasses that I am less excited about, even though I still have sort of parental affection for them, are the ones that do not shine with as much of that world flavor. A great example of this, even though I still am happy about many aspects of it, is, say, the champion fighter. The champion fighter achieves the goal that we set out for it, and that is to be a super simple fighter option. And it is definitely that. And for the person who wants to be able to just sit down at the table, have a robust character who can take tons of punishment, that subclass delivers the goods. But
it doesn't have that flavor.
It does not give you very much of a glimpse into the worlds of Dungeons and Dragons. And it also doesn't tell you a whole lot about that character outside combat. And so if, let's say, we were designing that today, and this is something Mike Merles and I have talked about, we would want to see a bit more world flavor in it. And you can see that in the design that we did in Xanathar's Guide, where you take a look at the fighter subclasses in that book, and each of them has a clear place in the world. When you look at the Cavalier or you look at the Samurai, you have a clear idea in your head who that person is, who they are culturally, how they might interact with people, not just in combat, but outside combat.
Right. That's cool. Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I like that questions like this. I don't know if you were a Beatles fan, but there was this one thing I remember reading where someone went through all of these interviews that the Beatles had, and like random members of them would be like, oh, I wrote that line, or I wrote this little bit, or that drum, was mine actually. And so someone actually started to say like, oh, which songs, because they were all credited the same way,
right.
which songs were whose, and I feel like that's what's happening here in D&D, where it's like, okay, everyone now is, all right, Jeremy helped with those, and Aaron did these, and then we'll figure out like, which parts everybody kind of did, and that's, it's obviously a group effort.
Oh yeah, I mean with the Player's Handbook in particular, our whole team was working on it. With the Wizard and the Cleric subclasses, a number of the designers, we were working together on those. But they were ones where I especially, late in the process, was like, oh, come to me, my babies.
I can do some tweaking to make sure this works.
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, that's really cool. Well, here's another question, because we recently released the Wayfinder's Guide to Eberron up on the Dungeon Masters Guild. So a lot of people are asking questions about that world and how it works with 5th edition. So Renegades asked the question, what are your thoughts on Warforged, and how do you wish to approach it in the next UA or book or thing going forward?
Oh, and you know what? I bet we got this question
before
we released. Yeah. There are actually several questions on here. It's funny that we got right before we did that. So you can see in the Wayfinder's Guide what my current thinking is on the Warforged, because Keith Baker and Rudy did work on the Warforged, then handed it over to us. We then tinkered with it. And so the Warforged that's in the Wayfinder's Guide right now and in Unearthed Arcana kind of represents our collective idea of, well, this is where the direction we think the Warforged can go in. Definitely there's room for some evolution, for some refinement. We're already seeing great questions and observations about things we could clarify in the Warforged. Anytime, as anyone watching the show who has been an avid reader of Unearthed Arcana and has been listening to our talks about rules, knows anytime armor class calculations are a part of anything in the game, that always generates a lot of conversation, because there's always a bit of confusion about, well, if I have these 3 armor calculations, how do they interact with each other? And again, the answer is they don't. Anytime you have multiple armor class calculations, you use only one of them and you choose which one. And so naturally, almost always, you're going to pick the one that gives you the highest armor class.
Right.
But yeah, we will be reading all of your feedback very carefully about not only the Warforged, but the Changeling and the Shifter and the Kalashtar, and make any necessary tweaks in the months ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we know that Warforged is a big part of that world, and so it's going to take a little bit to nail how it works. So this is another interesting question about your own campaign. But how have you handled D&D edition changes within your own campaign world? Is that something that you've had to experience from a long time running campaign?
Absolutely. So before my previous campaign, my campaign had been going on for about 5 years, and it started in 4th edition and ended in 5th edition. So we actually did an edition transition in the midst of the campaign, and I've done that before. I've experienced a D&D campaign going from 2nd edition to 3rd edition, and before that I experienced a campaign going from 1st edition to 2nd edition. So I've gone down that path several times. One thing that has always helped each time we've gone through those transitions is that the campaigns that I run and that I tend to be a player in, although I'm rarely these days a player, I'm almost always DMing, is they have tended to be very story focused and not about the mechanics of a particular edition. So we have generally found the transition from one edition to another to be a pretty smooth process. Honestly, one of the most interesting challenges we had was going from 4th edition to 5th edition, because 4th edition had a different number of levels. 4th edition went up to level 30 rather than level 20. So part of that conversion process was deciding where the characters would end up level-wise in 5th edition after we made that conversion. But it ended up going smoothly. We just, rather than trying to literally translate every ability that a character might have in one edition to the next, we've always been very flexible on this option in the new edition is close enough to the one in the past. We just try to get, a character that approximates what a person was playing before, and we just run with that. Again, with the focus on, let's keep telling our story.
So there wasn't some large event that kind of happened that kind of did the transition for you. You just kind of seamlessly did it through the design. There's something to that for sure. There doesn't need to be a cataclysm each time. There's new rules out there. You can, as a designer and a DM, you can kind of just Band-Aid over that, and that makes a lot of sense.
Well, because as some listeners have probably heard me say many times before, in my mind, and this has been true for the decades I've been working on D&D and playing D&D and DMing it, the rules serve the story and not the other way around. And I've only ever had a rule change influence the story if it was just a sort of particularly exciting change where it inspired me to think, oh, wow, this change in the rules could represent this kind of cosmic shift. But most of the time, the change can happen in the background.
Kind of seamlessly, right? That makes sense. All right, well, here's another question from chat. This is Random AK. Hi, Random. Will there ever be rules for disarming an opponent or ways to go from grappling to restraining an opponent or even other non-lethal options for combat? Now, I know there's rules already in there for that, but maybe he's talking about she's talking about expanding those type of rules or things that you do in your game to do that.
So what I would say first off is go take a look at the Dungeon Master's Guide. I often think that this book is essentially the trove of hidden treasures of D&D, because so often people will say, are we ever going to get X? And I'm like, well, it turns out X is in this book that came out 4 years ago.
To the fact that we've even done, I think, 2 segments of Sage Advice where it was like, here's all the things that's in the book.
Yes. No, and I get it, because the Dungeon Master's Guide is such a kind of, I often refer to it lovingly as like it's the grandmother's attic of D&D books, where you crawl up there with light streaming in through the window, and it's like there's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, you blow off the dust. You're like, oh, I had no idea this was here.
Yes.
So long ago.
So I have the book open because right here in a section called Combat Options, there are options like disarming an opponent, climbing onto a bigger creature, shoving people aside, tumbling, overrunning. We have a whole section on having lingering injuries, like breaking your arm or breaking your leg. It's all right here. So I'd say dive in. If it turns out what you're looking for isn't here, do let me know on Twitter, because we can always explore things in Unearthed Arcana or a future product. But I would say often, if you're wondering, why doesn't D&D have a rule for X? Give the Dungeon Master's Guide a look, because there's a good chance there's a version of the thing you're looking for. And actually, along that line, here, I'm going to feed you a question.
Oh, go for it. Yeah. Which one do you want to jump into?
Oh my God, I just lost it.
Was it on the other one?
It might have been on the other page. Where did it go? It had to do with pets, because this was a big topic on Twitter recently.
And the Beastmaster Ranger.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about.
Oh, the one on pets. I know which one you're talking about.
Yeah. Here, ask me another question, and then once we find the question,
okay,
and then you can ask that one to me.
Sure. Are you okay talking about the Ranger?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
I'm okay talking about anything other than products we haven't announced.
Okay, well, great. I won't ask you any of those questions.
I might again have to say, oh, I'll look it up. Because by the way, I'm in these in between times. I'm going to Scrying and Layman's tiny hut. I haven't
in the
forgotten that
downtime,
one.
you still have to get into those.
Yes.
I'm going to just read this one because it does sum up a little bit of what I think a bunch of people are talking about in the chat. Draconis says, any chance we will see a UA dealing with the new substitute options for Rangers and other classes, subclasses soon?
So we have talked at various points about the possibility of having alternative class features as something to explore. Something I mentioned on Twitter over the past week is we are not pursuing that rapidly right now because we realized it has been long enough since we've done an overall satisfaction survey about the entire game. We want to get that data before we proceed because the last thing we want to do is essentially chase ghosts, because what we find, it's fascinating, what the audience finds satisfying versus dissatisfying changes over time. And so if we look at data from 3 years ago, that data might not be valid anymore. Now, we look at our survey data, we pair it with D&D Beyond stats. We also look at play patterns in Adventurers League. We look at what people are saying in Reddit. We also have marketing surveys that the corporation does. We go to all of these different data sources, look at the information together to try to get a holistic view of what's going on. And so again, before we go too far down a road of designing alternative class features for classes, we want to make sure that if we do it, we're doing the right features for the right classes, for the right subclasses.
Meaning you want to prioritize ones that seem to have the most feedback on, that type of thing?
Or we might discover there really is not big enough demand for us to do this. And we might discover it's better for us to invest our energy in new options or polishing options that already exist.
I see.
And like we even, later this year, there will be reprints of the 3 core books. It's been a while since we've issued errata for the 3 core books. I actually just approved the errata for the 3 core books earlier today, and there will be some tweaks in a few places, actually, I think that people will be pleased with, that will make it sort of unnecessary to have any kind of alternative features.
Cool.
And we will, of course, make those changes public as soon as we can.
Okay, sure, it makes sense. Here's another question from Chat Alden 7E, which I hope is not a prediction of which edition of Dungeons & Dragons you want to play. In your own games, do you require characters to have proficiency in a skill in order to help others on checks?
Typically, no.
No?
Unless it is a situation where a high level of training would be expected. And here I really rely on the descriptions my players give. I listen to how they describe the assistance that they're giving. And my decision as a DM is almost always based on that. And what's interesting is my players in my home game almost never, in our couple years of play now in this current campaign, have invoked the help action. I'm, as a DM, the one who tells them, well, based on your description of how you two are conferring about this or how you're both trying to drag that statue, you're helping each other, and here is the benefit you're going to have because of that. So again, I'm always listening as a DM. I think listening as a DM is actually even more important than talking, to hear not only what interesting things the players are describing that you can then incorporate into the story ahead, but also to always have an ear for what are your players enjoying and what do they want more of in your campaign.
Makes sense. Very cool. This might also be a pretty simple yes/no question, but I liked it, so I need to read it. Carrion Worm asks, I read on a wiki that rock gnome originate from diamonds. So can one be sacrificed to res a party member? That's outside the box thinking there, Carrion Worm.
Yes. So Wikipedia is not an official rule source for D&D. So I would say look at the core books. However, if in your home campaign setting, rock gnomes are diamonds, well, consult with your DM about potential gnome uses in spell components. It sounds like a really dark campaign.
It does. Yeah, I don't want to be a part of that blood diamond trade at all.
It's so dark.
Yeah. So Carrion Worm is the name, so that makes a little bit of sense that it would be a dark question. Here's another interesting one that goes back to old editions and how to kind of use it in 5th edition, but BNAA UK. I'm going to say the B is silent, so nah UK. How would you implement things from past edition like aging effects and ill effects from dying and being brought back to life?
So it's funny. It was the injury rules I mentioned earlier were on my mind because I read that question in advance. So what I would recommend is if you want to, in your game, make things a bit grimmer, more dangerous, take a look at the lingering injury rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Take also a look at the rules for diseases and also the rules on exhaustion. And you can use the different pieces in those different subsystems to really pretty easily concoct maybe a set of debilitations that will occur as you get older. And I hope in the real world we don't end up suffering too many of them. But yeah, you have some inspiration in the books already. We have intentionally not made those a key part of the game. We'd like to really leave it up to DMs and players how much of those sorts of real-world issues they want to experience in their games. Because some people, there are some people where they make their characters young adults, others people who are middle-aged, other people want to play teenagers or kids, other people want to, I often love playing a doddering old man. I essentially, myself, when I make my doddering old men characters, who are almost always my wizard Cornelius, I just tank his physical ability scores to represent that. And so he sort of experiences his age constantly, and that I enjoy that adversity when I'm playing that character. Because when I do play, I actually kind of like it when my character isn't great at everything. They often have something they're really good at, but I often find having some sort of adversity really helps a character come to life.
And I think lingering injuries is a good resource there. But when I first read that question, I was thinking exhaustion might do really well to cover just the general feeling old, right? And maybe it's not always you have a level or two of exhaustion, but you could roll on a short table of 1d3 and how old do you feel this day? Yeah. Right? Yeah. And then some days you're like, oh, I feel fine. I'm spry. I can do whatever I need to do. But then some days you're just dealing with a especially bad day. Maybe there's a storm coming, and so your arthritis kicks in. There's fun ways that you can use that as well.
Yeah, probably the simplest way to implement what you're talking about would be to say in this homebrew rule that you create about age, that once you've reached a certain age, and the age would be different depending on your species, that you might need to take a certain number of short rests each day, and if you don't, you get a level of exhaustion. Essentially,
slow down.
Yeah, exactly. I need a nap.
I just need to lean here. Just give me 5 minutes.
Yes.
Go do some spells and stuff.
I need an extra long lunch.
Oh, now I really want to play a doddering old man as a character. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I think players need more excuses to take short rests as well. Very cool. Did
you find the pet question?
I didn't find the pet question, but you can go ahead and I remember that on Twitter. So
I think did I hallucinate it?
Maybe it wasn't just it printed up, but I do like the question. So if you want to answer it, it was how can you add pets into a class, right?
No. So the question was it was about if we would consider creating for Unearthed Arcana a set of sort of simple class templates to add on to pets to represent them.
Here it is. Yep.
Okay.
No, Outprint Mind. Yep. No,
okay,
I didn't realize that was the one you were talking about. You mentioned a while. This is from Outprint Mind. So thank you for this question. You mentioned a while ago that instead of a built-in animal companions to classes, you recommend giving class levels of fighter, for example, to beasts. What do you think about the possibility of a Unearthed Arcana with simple class options made for companion creatures, for hunting wolves, scouting owls, helping squirrels, etc. I just want a helping squirrel in my life. That's
Yes,
pretty cool.
Yes. I would love to have a little squirrel who's just there to...
Yeah. Can you get to make the coffee for me? Okay, thank you.
Or just to snuggle up sometimes.
We all need squirrel hugs every once in a while.
So, in fact, we have talked about doing kind of a simplified version of the adding class levels to NPCs and monster rules. Those rules exist in the Dungeon Master's Guide. They're pretty straightforward. They also have the advantage of being totally open-ended because they allow you to add whatever class levels are appropriate to the creature that you're modifying. But we do understand that it can be a little daunting for some people. So at some point, there is a chance we would explore a simpler version of that rule. But in the meantime, I do recommend people give the Dungeon Master's Guide version of the rule a try. You'll find, especially if you take something like the Champion Fighter, that it syncs up really well with a lot of beast options. You can even use Rogue on some creatures. And if you really want to get crazy, you could have some magical creature and give it some levels in Sorcerer. So there are some really interesting things that you can do when you start experimenting with giving class levels to companions. And when I say companions, this also includes humanoid companions. And for them, it becomes far easier to conceptualize them having levels in a character class. And also, one of the many reasons I wanted this question to come up is I think I surprised a little people recently on Twitter when I said, well, the default assumption in the game is that you can just befriend people and critters and have them come along with you. And people said, well, do we have a resource for this default assumption? You do indeed. This is I didn't plan on this, but this is becoming the theme of this episode. It's in the Dungeon Master's Guide.
Read the Dungeon Master's Guide.
There's a whole chapter of the Dungeon Master's Guide on creating NPCs, and it includes a section on having NPCs join your party and what the implications of that are. And so that's all spelled out there for you. And keep in mind, when the game says non-player character, that doesn't have to mean a humanoid.
Yeah.
It could be an awakened tree. It could be again that wolf I've brought up. It could be a glorious stag you met in some fey wood.
Yeah. It could be a benevolent spirit.
Yeah, exactly.
It could be anything.
It could be some benevolent ghost who's tagging along. NPC can mean many things. It really just means it's any creature in the world controlled by the Dungeon Master who has kind of graduated from creature X to person of whatever species they are, who has a name, who has a story, might be an opponent, might be a foil, might be a friend, or might even be a companion.
Or a sentient banana.
A sentient banana.
As C1016 says.
Please no, because if it goes off, then there's that banana smell and it starts browning.
No, it's true. You have to have your cleric cast. What is that spell that keeps everything fresh?
Oh yes.
Yeah, all the time. You're like, hey buddy, come on, the banana's reeking again. While we're talking about classes and subclasses and how they might work together, Lakesa asks, why are there no rules for something like multi-subclassing? Is that something that you guys have thought about, multiple subclasses within the same character?
We get this question occasionally. It is intentionally not part of our design. Subclasses are really designed as a piece. We design it so that once you start going down the subclass path, that many of the features in a subclass are meant to work together. And we have not balanced the game for subclasses in the same class to be mingled. And not necessarily because we're worried about you being overpowered, although there are certainly some combinations where you might be. No, we're worried that some of those combinations just wouldn't do anything. Because sometimes a higher level feature in a subclass relies on you having a lower level feature, or a lower level feature might also sort of only fully come into its full potential until later on as you level up in that subclass. So yeah, it's just not a part of the game's design. My recommendation is, let's say you find yourself wanting a different subclass in your class, just talk to your DM, look for a good story moment for it, and just swap the subclasses out. You're not going to break anything in the game by, in fact, we did this not too long ago in my home game. The Paladin, played by James Wyatt, started out as a Paladin of the Oath of Devotion, but because of all of the many horrors that he has faced in our Gothic horror campaign, and also his Paladin having a odd, totally by chance, not because of my choice or James's, but where the dice have fallen, an odd propensity for like every gross substance in the game to end up in his character's face. So if there's buckets of blood, they're going to end up in the Paladin's face. If there's some strange sentient black oil, it's in the Paladin's face again. So after all of these terrible experiences, that Oath of Devotion Paladin, James said, how about he becomes a Paladin of the Oath of Vengeance? And I said, sounds great. We decided his character spent a night in prayerful vigil in one of the great temples of the city where the campaign is taking place. And at the end of this night of grim prayers, his Paladin emerged from the shrine, now a member of the Oath of Vengeance. And he just rejiggered his character so that that character now had the features appropriate for his level for the Oath of Vengeance.
Right. Then that makes a lot more sense rather than trying to pick and choose abilities from different multi-classes that can lead to feeling like like you have a worse character all of a sudden rather than one that is what you want. Right?
Yeah.
And I love that it's tied to the story too, or
yes.
at least tied to the character.
Yeah.
I think that's why Joe Manganiello's Arkan character took the Oath of Vengeance, was because it was, there was a story reason for it, and that makes the most sense. So I love that. So here's another question for a subclass and whether it can be story or not. So Zenarch asks, would you consider all deities fair game for Celestial Warlock patron? Like, for example, Kelemvor, or is this more meant to be a solar or unicorn? For the Celestial Warlock patron?
So Warlock patrons are really meant to be full of story potential for a particular campaign. It's why they have these names that are sort of mythical and abstract. We don't, for instance, for the fiend, we don't give you the name of a particular fiend. We don't say Asmodeus or Orcus. It's just the fiend. Basically, you fill in the blank. And so that means if there is a celestial being that makes sense for your Warlock and your DM's campaign, I'd say go for it, even if it isn't one of the examples given in the write-up for the subclass. Same for the Great Old One, same for the Archfey. Those are really meant to be wide open for you so that you can tell the story that you want to tell for your character.
So there's no strict rules for it. That's good to know, right?
No. It's really, that is a character and world building choice for a player and their DM.
Very cool. Do you know about Layman's tiny hut yet? Or are you still
I'm almost there.
Okay.
So
we'll come back. That'll be the closer.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So in the meantime, Farron Gray asks, any thoughts on expanding ritual type spells, like the possibility of mythals and elven high magic, or some of the examples he gives?
So
or she gives.
We have talked about elven high magic, especially in some of our Forgotten Realms books. That comes up in the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. There's some reference to it in Storm King's Thunder. There is also reference to it in Dragon Heist. We have tended to prefer, and still prefer, leaving things like mythals and other and mythical magic in general, really a piece of story, partly so that DMs won't feel bound when you all decide you want in your campaign to come up with some crazy magical effect that the elves of old created, that you don't feel limited by a system. Because part of the point is their magic didn't follow the rules that magic currently follows. They did something truly wondrous and also not repeatable. It is a unique effect. And so I'd say if you are wanting to create one of those effects, let your imagination go wild, create something truly mythic, if people heard about it, they'd be talking about it for generations. Now, when it comes to expanding the number of spells that are rituals, this is actually something we're very cautious about, because rituals, and this is often sort of hidden, people don't always notice it right away. Rituals are actually at-will spells for ritual casters because you don't need a spell slot to cast it. In the case of a wizard, as long as you have your spell book there, you have access to these rituals. And so we have to be very careful about any spell we tag as a ritual, because we always have to do the mental exercise. Are we okay with this spell being cast at will? Okay, again, for balance reasons and for world building and storytelling reasons. So that's why we do not release a whole ton of rituals for the game. You'll also notice we don't release a whole ton of cantrips for the game, and it's for a similar reason. As soon as any piece of magic becomes usable at will, if you're designing it, you need to ask the question, am I okay with this happening over and over and over and over and over again? And what would the implications be for the world? We at one point had a number of spells in our early design of 5th edition that were rituals or cantrips, and we changed them so that they weren't, because we realized they had terrible world-building implications. I believe, I'm trying to remember which one of it. One of the spells having to do with creating large quantities of water at one point was either a ritual or a cantrip. And we realized this spell alone would undermine all of a setting like Dark Sun.
Right.
So we have to make sure we don't just hand out, we set up an entire campaign or setting where there is this core conflict or this core bit of scarcity that the whole campaign is about struggling with, and we have a first level spell that solves it.
Yeah, right. That you can cast at will. All it takes is 10 minutes, and you have all the water that could feed this, a village would drink in a week, right?
The other thing, quite frankly, when it comes to anything that is usable at will, not just magic, but this also goes for non-magical abilities, there's also an annoyance test. I always think, I'll pause when I'm evaluating a piece of design that I've done or someone else on the team has done. I think, all right, if this thing can be used without limit, is it going to annoy the hell out of me for this thing to be used over and over and over again?
As the dungeon master?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because D&D has at its core a certain social contract. It's a co-op game. It's a friendly game where we gather together to play. And many of us self-police. But most of us have had the experience of being at the table with the person who doesn't self-police, where because the game has put the red button in front of them and they realize they can just press it over and over again. Basically, I like to put as few of those red buttons in the game as possible,
right?
Just to make sure it remains a friendly co-op game, and that people are not getting to the end of a session and being going, oh my God, is Bob using that ability for the 50th time in the last 90 minutes?
And now, so that answers a little bit of a question here in the chat, which was like, why wouldn't that water creating spell just be banned for use in something like Dark Sun or something like that? But it's mostly to prevent what you're talking about now, where it's like, if it's as written, you don't want to have to continually say like, no, that button you cannot press.
Yeah, and it's also about making sure we continue to tell a story we're comfortable with about our spellcasters. You can imagine that if low-level spellcasters in D&D had the answer for every mundane problem and could answer every mundane problem on a large scale, that would change the shape of all of our D&D worlds.
Yeah.
And many of those spellcasters would become either the rulers of all nations, or they would be almost like indentured magic servants forced to use these wondrous abilities to solve all of society's problems all the time. Now, a person listening might think, yeah, but like a low-level cleric can just heal people's wounds. But a low-level cleric cannot do that many times per day. A low-level cleric can't just walk around raising everybody from the dead. A low-level cleric can't, every day fill, every well with water, 50 miles around. Low-level cleric can do some of those things, a little taste of those things.
Right.
So again, we always think about what's the implication for the worlds of D&D and for a campaign.
Here's a very good question that I think you're the only person who could possibly answer it. This is from the Dark Lorax. Who is the will most cantrip use as a target, and why does he deserve so much ire?
The who? What?
The will. It's an at-will joke.
Oh, got it. Puns.
I did that specifically
No.
because you love puns.
No, I do not. But I always appreciate them. Because part of my shtick is, of course, I always say I don't like them, but then I actually do.
It's part of the shtick, and then you have to be like, oh, you got me again.
You got me again, guys.
So scrying, do you want to try and hit scrying up?
Not yet. Keep
okay.
going.
All right. Is there?
I'm going to keep Armando waiting until the very end.
I know this is good programming. So Hollow Vex asks, is there a spell level limit you have for creating ritual spells? You don't want to necessarily have a 9th level ritual spell.
Yeah, you'll notice that most of our rituals are at mid to low level. And again, that's because they are effectively very slow at-will spells. So that's one reason why you are unlikely to ever see many high-level ones, because high-level spells are often just wackadoo on purpose. It's why we constrain how many spell slots you get at those upper levels. Where you'll look at your table of spell slots and you go down the slope and you get down there and you're like, oh, just one, and it never goes up. That's on purpose, because then that allows us to make 9th level spells, for instance, just crazy bonkers.
Yeah, they can really feel like you're game changing.
Yep.
At some level. Right?
But you get that crazy bonkers no more than once a day, and that's very much on purpose. We don't, to go back to the red button thing I mentioned before, we do not want you to have a 9th level spell that's a button you can just keep pushing, and just as long as you spend 10 minutes doing it as a ritual.
What about, and this is just me spitballing a little bit here, but like what about the if there was an additional thing like this ritual takes 24 hours, or this ritual spell actually needs a week of casting time by 9 9th level spells, or something that like gives it more of a thing. Obviously, a dungeon master can do this, no matter what. But if there's some design space there, that would be really fun for plot reasons.
So at that point, we would probably just break out of the spell system and make it a piece of ad hoc design, where this is just this extraordinary magical process that you must go through, and you perform this rite over this course of days with a particular effect. If we decided we wanted to bind it up in the spellcasting system, I still wouldn't want it to be a ritual, because if it's at 9th level, I'm probably going to want to tax your 9th level slot each day you are spending casting that 9th level ritual. Because if it's a 9th level ritual, remember 9th level, you're casting things like Wish. Good grief, that should be mighty magic, and should be tapping into your store of magical energy, and making it also, again, as a designer, I don't want you to still have Wish in your back pocket every day. Right. I want to make sure if you are engaged each day in 9th level magic, you're paying the cost. It is meant to be costly. It is meant to be heavily constrained. We want you, if you're casting magic repeatedly, to rely on your lower level spell slots. That's what they're there for.
Makes sense. Very cool. All right, one more, and then I think we have to get to the scrying answer. This one is from Long Tom Dewey. When a vampire bite deals necrotic damage that lowers max HP and piercing damage, which happens first?
Oh, that's a good question. Here, let's take a look.
Okay.
So before I get to the vampire, I can tell you that when we write a monster stat block, and often you'll see in the hit line, it will say something like, the monster deals 7 bludgeoning damage plus 6 lightning damage, and then make a Constitution saving throw, and if you fail, you're sad for a day, or whatever the effect is. So we write those with the assumption that you're going to do them in order. A DM doesn't have to follow that, but it's good to know that we write them in that order with the expectation that you will resolve them in that order. If ever it is absolutely crucial that they happen in a particular order, you will often see words like, and then something happens, to make sure it's clear to you this sequence is vital. So specifically with the vampire, here it just says 7 piercing damage plus 10 necrotic damage. You'll notice there is no and then here. And you could honestly apply these damage values in either order given the wording here. Default is just go with the order that's printed, but you're certainly not going to break anything if the necrotic damage is applied and then the piercing damage. In actual play, often as a DM, especially in my home game where I start to become very familiar with my players' characters, if I know none of them has any relevant ability that applies to the damage types in play, I will just give them the total. I would just say you take 17 damage. But that's only if I know for sure nobody has something that's going to give them resistance to necrotic damage. No one is vulnerable to either of these damage types. And so that means when let's say I'm at a convention DMing an Adventurers League game and I'm DMing for characters I'm unfamiliar with, then I do very carefully state each amount of damage and which damage type is going out, because I don't know if a character at the table is going to be able to resist some or all of that particular ability or be vulnerable to it.
Right. But what about some attacks that in this question lower max HP? Does that happen before or after?
Oh, that happens after. So you'll notice. All right, let's go back to the vampire. Sorry, I missed that part of the question.
Yeah, I think that's what the guy is trying to get, or the person is trying to get at.
Okay,
because
thank you.
That is.
All right, so you take the damage, and yeah. So here, take the sentences in their order. So you have the first one. You take the 7 piercing plus the 10 necrotic. The target's, and then once you've read that, the target's hit point maximum is reduced by an amount equal to the necrotic damage taken. So yeah, not only has the necrotic damage happened already, this is written assuming all that damage in that previous sentence has already happened. We do not write our sentences with the idea they're going to just be randomly reordered or scrambled. Just deal with them in order, and you'll be good.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're past time, so we want to get to the scrying question.
All right. Yes.
So in case you are only listening now, I will re-find it so that we can get it going for you. Where did I put it now?
I think it was in the chat.
You were right.
And I remember the question. Armando is asking, is it possible to have a scrying sensor appear inside Layman's tiny hut?
That's it.
So for those of you who don't have the spells right in front of you the way I do, scrying lets you scry on a particular person. It also allows you to scry on a location. And when you do that, when you're peeking in on a place, or a person, an invisible scrying sensor appears there. Now, the reason why this question is coming up is Layman's tiny hut specifies that spells and other magical effects can't extend through the dome or be cast through it. And so really the question is, does a scrying sensor sort of popping into being next to somebody inside Layman's tiny hut count as going through it? I as a DM, and again, many of you who've listened to me for a while know I often say this, I interpret things in the way most generous to my players. And so if they erected Layman's tiny hut with the expectation, and because often this spell is used to essentially hide out, I would make it so that that scrying sensor was not going to pop into being there. That said, though, rules as written, it is a little gray, and I know that's why the question came up, because the sensor is not literally passing through. And Layman's tiny hut, if I was going to, let's say, just lay aside my generosity as a DM, but instead give a kind of rules as written interpretation, I would say that sensor is not passing through and could just pop into being next to the person. Because really, Layman's tiny hut is imagining things like lightning bolts shooting at you, things that would actually pass through a barrier. It's not really getting at something like a person suddenly bamfing into place, or a thing bamfing right next to you. For those of you who do not read old Marvel comics, Bamf is the sound that Nightcrawler makes when he teleports. I realize sometimes I just say Bamf, and these people probably have not read the X-Men.
I knew what you meant, though. It's a poof of smoke and appearing. That makes total sense.
Yes, because my nerdery is broad and deep. So I would say, Armando, rules as written, Layman's tiny hut is not going to stop it, but rules as sort of fun, the way I would interpret it for my players, I would give it to them, that their little hut is keeping that prying eye out of their way.
There's other protection spells that they might want to cast in addition to that as well. But
because honestly, if they're really attempting to escape detection, there are other spells in the game that give you protection from various divination effects.
That type of stuff, right?
Yeah,
that makes total sense. All right, well, we are well past time. We got one question here that is pertinent to my next part of this segment is, how can people get in touch with you to ask you questions about D&D rules or anything else?
The best place is on Twitter, and I actually, looking at the monitor, see my Twitter handle there, Jeremy E. Crawford. I get asked sometimes, what does the E stand for? It's my middle name, Eric. Jeremy E. Crawford, please send your questions there. Because Twitter loves to devour my notifications, I sometimes don't see your questions. I'm not ignoring you. Sometimes Twitter is just very hungry and ate your question. So if I don't answer it, give it a week or two and try again. And I always eventually to get to the questions. Also, if you take a look at the Sage Advice Compendium PDF, there are a number of my old rules answers there collected. The sageadvice.eu website also has collected a bunch of my Twitter answers. So there are resources available if you're looking for one of my old rules answers. And I, every month, answer some new rules questions there on Twitter.
If there's, some people out there don't use Twitter, is there any other way to get questions to you other than when we do these Q&A sessions?
Those are the best ways.
Yeah.
We do have a Sage Advice email inbox, but it tends to be a
but
big...
don't go there.
It tends to pile up. And honestly, I often find that Twitter is best because then if I answer the question for one person, it often means I'm answering it for hundreds of people at once. We've also been asked if we'll be doing any more written Sage Advice columns. The answer is yes. It's just been a really busy year, but we do have another compilation of questions and answers coming up, as well as some new errata documents for some of our books.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jeremy. That's it for this segment and for this little bit. Thank you very much. I will be back in the different studio over there by 3:30. So I will see you over there, guys. I'll be back in a little bit. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.